I've gotten to the point to where when you get letters from inmates, you look at them and there's always a little skepticism, right? It's like, oh,
Yeah.
is it really that bad? But when the same letters are coming from staff, I'm sort of putting the two together and saying that that's really what's going on.
Uh-huh.
So we see a lot of the problems playing out, and these places are, as I put in that article in Forbes and other articles that I've written, there are considerable number of problems out there.
Over 1 million Americans face sentencing every year, and it will be the most important day of their lives. But we don't fully understand the system, how broken it is, and what we can do to make it better. I'm Doug Passon. I'm a 25-year criminal defense lawyer and a sentencing expert. My goal is to bring more awareness, more fairness, and more humanity to the sentencing process. So, are you ready? Then let's get set for sentencing. Hey everybody, Doug Passon coming to you from Studio 3553 in Scottsdale, Arizona. Helping us get set for sentencing today, guess what? We're going back to prison, back to the BOP. I have three incredible guests on the podcast. I think this is the first time I've had three guests at once, so we're breaking major new ground here. It's
Like the
very
Brady Bunch. It's like the
it
Brady Bunch on
it
here.
it is almost like we need Alice in the middle. But so Walt Pavlo, you met Walt in episode 18. It was entitled Prison Consultants and the Myth of the Fixer. We had a few things to say about some of the other prison consultants running around out there doing what they're doing. But Walt, of course, is the head of an amazing organization called Prisonology. And what differentiates Prisonology from some of the other folks out there is really the human resources that Walt has on staff, because these are exceptionally qualified, exceptionally knowledgeable, experienced people, in many cases, former Bureau of Prison officials. And we have two of those today as well. So, Maureen Baird, welcome back for your second appearance on Set for Sentencing.
Thank you.
Yes, it's so good to see your face. So you met Maureen in episode 3. You were one of my very first. You were episode 3. Do you know what episode this is? We're on like 67 now.
Oh,
I think
wow.
this is going to be
Wow.
67. Maureen was in the ground floor, and it was such a very important episode. It was telling the story of prison at sentencing. And really what we were trying to do was zero in on the fact of when your client has special needs, maybe they're aged, maybe they have health concerns, maybe they have psych concerns, how desperately unbearable a prison sentence is going to be compared to the average offender without those issues going into the Bureau of Prisons. And as we move forward a year or more later after that, it really, and I've had some personal experience with my own clients here, where when white collar, especially, they're going to a camp, and you think a camp is going to be Disneyland, a country club, pickleball.
So I've been with Prisonology for, I don't know, 6 months now. God, it's flown.
Oh, you are the new kid on the block.
Yeah, absolutely. And not only that, my first name is Jan. And so with the Brady Bunch, I actually do fill one of those chairs. So,
Very clever.
So
so
it's
there we
going to be
go.
Marsha. Maureen is close to Marsha. Marsha. All right.
I matriculated from the BOP with about 34 years of experience. Did what a lot of people do. I was a correctional officer for a short period of time, and then kind of worked my way through case management positions and then into management. Was an associate warden at MCC Chicago. Worked in regional offices, got a good global perspective of what the agency does. And near the end of my career, I worked in the residential reentry branch. So it's kind of like start to finish. From the moment you're arrested, I've been with felons to the point where we kick them out back into the community. So that's kind of how I landed here.
Perfect. So you two, especially Jan and Maureen, are bringing just a firsthand inside perspective into the inner workings of the BOP. So let's dig in. I think that from where I'm sitting right now today, the BOP may stand for Bureau of Prisons, but if more likely it stands for big old problems. There are big old problems in the BOP. And I want to just kind of throw it to anybody. We're just going to go down the list. Again, judges think a BOP's got this. Everything's cool. And anytime you ever say things are not cool in the BOP goes, no, no, really, they're cool. We got this. And nothing happening here. So tell me, what does a judge need to know about the truth of what's happening in the BOP system right now? We'll talk generally, and then we'll kind of get more specific, especially down to the camp level.
If you want, I'll start off only because, not that I'm the expert of these two amazing people, but from the mail that I get, just looking over here, how many of these I get from people that are, doing all sorts of, things that, they're telling me the problems that they're seeing in camp, the staffing shortages, BOP people call me about the staffing shortages, the medical staff that is lacking or missing or not competent, mental health, some of the problems that with that, but just the whole culture has really changed. And, I've gotten to the point to where when you get letters from inmates, you look at them and there's always a little skepticism, right? It's like, oh, is it really that bad? But when the same letters are coming from staff, I'm sort of putting the two together and saying that that's really what's going on. So we see a lot of the problems playing out, and these places are, as I put in that article in Forbes and other articles that I've written, there are considerable number of problems out there.
And by the way, let's talk about that article in Forbes, because it's an excellent article. It's called "The Unnecessary Risk of Incarcerating Minimum Security Inmates," and I will put a link to that article in the show notes. Walt writes for Forbes and primarily on prison punishment, sentencing issues, and all of his work is outstanding. So so let's dig into staffing then, because I'm with you. I have clients who write me those letters too, and one in particular from a camp. I'm not going to single out any camp on this call and any facility on this call, but the stories that he was describing really made me question whether it was legit, because they were so crazy. And I did some digging, and I actually found a staff member too on the inside and confirmed all of it. And so from a staffing perspective, I'll just tell you what my big problems are there. One is client has severe mental health issues, and he is seen once a month for a mental health check-in. And that's crazy. And he has a very good therapist on the outside that thus far they won't even let him communicate with. So the judge sentenced him knowing he had severe, complex post-traumatic stress disorder. And we argued at sentencing, you send him to prison, it's going to exacerbate that, and he's not going to get the care that he needs, and he's going to come out worse than he went in. And the judge kind of brushed it off. And I think she probably did that because she assumed he'd get services. He'd get what he needed. He's not. And then there's this short staffing. The story is when the lights go out at night, the unruly inmates take over the dorm. There's fighting, there's alcohol, there's extortion. There's all those nightmare scenarios that you think about in a maximum security prison happening in a camp. And there's one guard on staff for the whole place. And that guard, there's so much chaos that the prisoners are fomenting that guard basically locks him or herself into their little office and doesn't come out because it's too much for one person to deal with. So the inmates are running the institution at that point. Have you heard those stories too? Especially the one guard thing blew my mind.
So exactly what you're saying, unfortunately, Doug, that is a true story. That is happening. There's always been one officer in the camp, really, regardless of how big the camp is. And sometimes that one officer gets pulled to go do something at the main institution. So then you have no officer at the camp. But I would say Jan and I started in the BOP around the same time in the late 1980s. In 80s, 90s, 2000s, things were very different. And then suddenly, probably around 2015, and even earlier, maybe a little earlier than that, things started shifting and changing. I retired in 2016. Jan retired just last year, just over a year ago. But when under the Trump administration, there was this big push on downsizing staff and the numbers of staff. And so the BOP had to reconfigure their whole staffing guidelines, and they ended up not, there was a lot of staff not being hired when staff were leaving the agency. So it dwindled the numbers down to really they had barely the number of staff to cover these posts. And when one person calls in sick, then that's a problem. So then the person that just worked the 8-hour shift now gets mandated to work another 8 hours. So now that person is working 16 hours. And not just the staffing challenges, but the culture of what's going on in these prisons has significantly changed too. And I think that started changing after Director Samuels left. And then there was a long period of time without a permanent acting director until Carvajal came in. But things got gradually worse. And now the BOP actually has a chance under the new director, Peters.
Tell me more about what you mean by change in culture. And Jan, you can weigh in on this too.
Or in inmate culture.
Either or.
Yeah. So with the camp inmates, camp inmates, and it was a lot like what you talked about, where it was kind of this country club scenario, and inmates were coming in and walking the track every day and working out, going to their job and coming back. And just in the last few years, I'm hearing more and more stories about what you're talking about. You've got inmates at the camp who are, and we've got some real true stories to give you that I think you're going to be shocked with. But camp inmates are asking other inmates, show us your papers. That's unheard of, show us your papers in a camp. So you have these businessmen acting all tough guys. Suddenly they became this, penitentiary inmate in their mind, and they're playing the tough guy and making, forcing other inmates to show us if you cooperated in your case. Things like that are changing, and Jan can talk more about it. And Walt has some great, specific stories that have happened.
Well, yeah, like one of the things that I thought was interesting in a camp situation is there's supposedly kind of like harder core offenders that are making their way into the camp. So there's gang stuff. It's not just macho businessmen. It's like there's gang activity, there's violent offenders who someone may, the extortion, beat downs, all these things. And I'm like, why are those people in camps? That's
true. That is happening.
Okay. So Jan, what's your take on all?
Well, I mean, there's so many different things going on in the Bureau right now, but I do think it all stems from the staffing issue. And I know we can kind of beat that to death, but staffing has so many concentric circles to it. Obviously, we don't have enough correctional officers. So then we don't have enough correctional officers to run a unit. So then we pull someone from education. So then nobody's in education. So the education programs are shut down. Then we pull officers from other areas to take medical trips. And if there's not enough officers take the medical trips, guess what happens? We cancel the medical trip. And so really important medical attention is being delayed. And so, it just goes on and on and on. I can give you, 20 more examples of that. And the staffing situation, I do think it ties in a little bit culturally to the climate of new hires. I know, and I think I could speak also from Maureen on that. When we first hired onto the Bureau of Prisons, we thought we had a great job, and we were invested in it, and we were so excited when we got our 3 years in, and so we were part of the Bureau, and now it seems that maybe the employment sector is not quite as interested in a pension program or a government program. I don't know how we attract better staff, but a lot of people are coming in and leaving. And so you're constantly in training mode. You're constantly in deficit mode. So it's a really hard pizza pie to put together, but the staffing is just killing the Bureau.
And it's interesting how interrelated these problems become then. So you mentioned, okay, low staffing means they're pulling people away from other posts, which means programming is shut down. I've actually heard they pull sometimes medical or psych people off of their posts to do run-of-the-mill routine stuff because of short staffing. So every single program is going to suffer. Now, I want to put a fine point on that, because programming is what, part of rehabilitation. If we're actually serious about rehabilitation in this system, then a client should be able to participate in meaningful programming. I think that probably should go without saying. And also, some of my clients are very high level people with advanced degrees and special skills. They can do programming. They could actually help uh, do programming too, if the institution would give them that opportunity. But that's not happening either. So now it's just idle time. And then, Walt, is that, I mean, we have the First Step Act where you have this opportunity to earn, extra early release or more credit off of your sentence for participating in programming. But what happens if there's no programming to participate in?
Maureen and I work a lot on First Step Act since really last January 2022, when it became important, because it meant reducing sentences. But what we have found is there's some programming, it's inconsistent. They seem to sort of just be going through the motions, and everybody gets a star. So I think that I would think it's going to it's going to have more structure to it as it goes. But as it is right now, I think the BOP is just having a tough time and just awarding points, for people participating in whatever programming they have, even if it's just their job, just to give them the points to have their sentences reduced. That seems to be where the focus is, and not necessarily on the quality of the content that they're giving.
So it's like my kid's little league team. Everyone gets a trophy.
Everybody gets a trophy.
Okay. Yep. All right. Well, at least they're getting credit. That's something. But well, Jan, so let's go back to this. So the climate of new hires, and it's hard to get good people, and there's huge turnover. It strikes me that this probably ties into another problem that we're seeing in the BOP, which is corruption, staff corruption. Is that a thing, and how does that play out?
Yes, there's definitely a lot of corruption. We're
What does that
seeing,
look like?
well, I mean, it could be as heinous as, raping raping inmates, as we've seen in Dublin not that long ago. It could be basically staff come on in and they bring all kinds of drugs in, they bring cell phones in, they participate, in, basically gang violence. They help gangs out in some areas and not in others. So it's hard when they're fighting against you against the good guys.
Yeah.
If
Yeah.
I
I
could
mean,
say one thing about that, Doug, and Jan hit on it with this, they bring these new stuff in, and there's supposed to be this huge training component, as it was for many years. But what happens is you don't have the number of staff or the appropriate staff to conduct the training. So this new hire, who doesn't know anything about prison, gets maybe 2 weeks of training in a classroom setting, and then he or she goes right up to the unit, the housing unit, and still really has no clue on what they're doing. So the training that they're getting are from the inmates, because they don't have anybody to call. They can't call the lieutenant's office, because they're told, don't call the lieutenant's office and ask questions unless you really, really need us. So they're at the mercy of the inmates, and the inmates are telling them how to run the unit. And you know how that goes. I don't even need to say how that goes. So I think part of this is the lack of training, and the training that they're getting from the inmates. It becomes really frustrating for staff. And a lot of staff end up then leaving because they weren't trained properly, or a lot of staff become corrupt because then they start bringing in cell phones or bringing in drugs.
You might not be shocked to hear that I get calls or texts all the time from inmates on cell phones, and I'm like, I can't talk to you on these phones. I just No, like you gotta, but like everyone's got a phone in there. It's amazing, and that's not happening unless the guards are bringing those things in. I mean, come on, and alcohol and things like that. I mean, I know you can make that stuff alcohol in there, but so that's a thing. And when you talk about, Maureen, that the inmates are training the guards, the inmates are training the inmates as well. Because my experience is, well, when you go in for the first time, you're supposed to get an inmate handbook, and you're supposed to have like an orientation pro. You're supposed to be guided on what are the rules of the road so you don't run afoul of them. And I had a client just recently. He was more than a month in. He had never received a handbook. He had never received any orientation. He had never talked with a case manager or a counselor. And so the inmates are telling him, do this, do that. One inmate told him, move your bunk out of here because I don't want you in here. So he moved his bunk. Then he got thrown in the hole because he didn't follow the proper procedure to let the staff know that he had changed cells or something like that.
Right, and I
course,
remember that story. He didn't
yeah.
even know he couldn't change cells because nobody would even staff wouldn't even talk to him or let him know what the rules were.
So, I mean, when we think about punishment, and I really am struggling with this in our system, because judges think, if we don't send you to prison, you're not getting punished. And that's another conversation I want to have with Jan in a little bit, I think, about alternatives to incarceration. But, like I said, they just give these sentences out very, very easily, very liberally. And I think at the back of their head, they're thinking stakes aren't that high. It's no big deal. And I would love to just hear some real life stories. Judge, I want you to know this is the kind of stuff that happens to real human beings when they get inside the walls of the BOP.
And I know we're focusing on camps today. It's a whole lot worse inside, right? But
yeah,
I mean, I think Walt is gonna really blow your mind with what he's about to tell you of something that just happened recently. And these are the things that are happening now at camps. And I think judges just have, I mean, I'm shocked sometimes when I hear these stories, and I worked in the system for almost 3 decades. So, well, why don't maybe you can share that story?
Well, Maureen and I had counseled a guy. He was getting ready to go to prison, and we were saying, here's what it's like. You go through the rules, and then he comes back to us after he's in there, and he says, "Hey, I'm riding in a car, like a mini gang." We're like, "What?" I mean, even we were taken aback by it, and what's your crime and all this other stuff. But other things that I've covered.
What does that mean? I'm riding in a car. I don't know what that means.
Go ahead, Maureen. You can give them that one real quick.
Yeah. Well, Jan, do you want to explain it? I'll go on forever, and I'd rather it be very succinct and concise.
Well, basically, a car it could be based on regional, like, hey, you're from DC, so you have to hang with us, or you're from Boston, so you got to be over here in this car. So it's a figurative, alliteration. So you got to ride in somebody's car. And so it could be, based on your crime. Could be, hey, we're all drug dealers, especially like maybe in a camp. But that's like the gist of it.
What's the purpose of being in a car? Would an inmate client want to be in a car? And why is that a bad thing to be in a car?
It's kind of like being,
I like my car.
Yeah, it's kind of like being like, when you're in high school, you rode with a gang of people, you associated with them, you had somewhere to sit down and eat in the chow hall. You have, some protection, some layers of protection in there. So that's kind of the gist of it. I mean, it has much more serious ramifications, in penitentiaries and medium security facilities.
Yeah.
But it's kind of interesting. This is happening, as Walt was saying, in a lower in a camp. So
in those medium security and penitentiary, the inmates have to ride in some car, because if they don't, then that's going to have some problems, right? So they do it for these afforded protections and kind of like safety. But then when that car decides they're going to assault somebody in another car, everybody in that car has to be on board. So you can't just be in the car and not be involved in the shenanigans or the stuff that goes on as a result of being in that car.
Doug, let me give you 2 examples, and then I'll let Maureen and Jan weigh in on this. These are 2 incidences that happened in camps. Okay, minimum security camps where like the people in there are going out into the community, some of them, and working, you know, outside the fence. Tucson camp. I'll name a camp. You know, I'll be specific. Tucson,
Okay.
this is within the last year. Tucson camp. Guy goes into visitation. His wife and children are waiting on him. He pulls out a pistol, points it at her head, and starts shooting. Luckily, fortunately, the gun didn't go off. They tackled the guy, and then now he's, you know, obviously in much more trouble. Forest City. There's two inmates are fighting over a cell phone. You know, who wants to use it? One guy pushes the other guy. Guy falls back, bumps his head. They try to take care of him. A little bit later in the night, he falls out of his bed and dies. Now you have one dead camper and another guy charged with murder. This is at a camp. I mean,
White collar.
White collar. These are all white collar guys. And you know, I'm not saying it was like a murder, like, you know, like Maureen and Jan have testified in some things that are like real murders. But, you know, this just tells you the level of, I think, just toxicity in our camps, that it's just it shouldn't be like this. It shouldn't be a country club. It really never was a country club, but it shouldn't be what's going on today.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, okay. What else? Anybody else have some stories about this? I mean, I think people will say, you know, that, well, that's really sad story, but these are really isolated. These are outliers. And I know not everyone's bringing guns into camps and things like that, but is there a case?
I'll give you an example that I'll let these two weigh in on.
Yeah.
You know, people who are sick are going to, you know, prison. They're minimum security people.
Yeah.
They're going to go to medical centers. And, you know, Jan or Maureen, you guys can talk, you know, the difference between a camp living, somebody who's maybe doing 6 months or, you know, a few years. What's it like in a medical facility because of their medical condition versus what life would be like in a camp?
Yeah, I'll go ahead.
Was that very,
Yeah, serving time in a federal medical center is not fun. A lot of times it's quite administrative, which means you've got all levels that are there. Some places deal with higher security, you know, inmates than others, but you're really in prison. It's you have all the same things that you would at a regular prison that has a fence around it, and, you know, a patrol, you know, somebody's roving around it with weapons. There's no minimum security medical center. So
like anybody with a problem, right? Whether they're penitentiary, you know, maximum security, medium, can't, anybody with a medical problem goes to the same spot. And I heard they don't even segregate people, you know, by those designations. So like you could have a minimum camp person housed with a murderer, ostensibly, right? In those places.
it's possible, yes.
Yeah. And you know, the health stuff is really important. And again, maybe that veers towards what Maureen and I talked about last time with special needs, but you know, it is to me a symptom of the larger problem, which is, well, I'll give you a horror story. Several years ago, we had a client who was sentenced on a Medicare kickback scheme. He got a really kind of awful sentence, I think like 7 years, but he was an older gentleman. He was like in his 70s. And that, if that wasn't bad enough, he was diagnosed with cancer. And the BOP said, no worries, we'll just send him to FMC at Butner. That's where we have our oncology ward, and he'll be fine. Everything will be fine. It's always fine. They always do this little standard letter that they send to the judges that we're BOP, we're awesome, we got this, no worries. And the judges will defer to that. Again, that's one of the main reasons I want to have this conversation. Judges, we need to look more closely at this. Don't defer to the BOP when the BOP says everything's fine, because now we're going to get into the same situation where I'm saying to the judge, look at the big old problems, even at camps. And you know, BOP is going to come back to them and say, oh, that's not true. That's not happening. Everything's fine. And this is a big systemic problem. And by the way, Bernie Greenspan was dead within 6 months of going to BOP, my client, with cancer, my 70-year-old client, who the judge felt so compelled that he just had to serve that time in prison, even though he had cancer. Okay.
I remember the case. I worked on that case with you.
Yeah, I think that was our first case together, Maureen.
And so we deal with this a lot. And I think, that the piece that's missing from what you said is it's the attorney, the client's attorney, responsibility to make sure that they have somebody maybe like us who are BOP experts to be able to convey either through an affidavit, a declaration on what is this person going to experience when he goes to one of these medical centers and what's going to happen.
Absolutely.
That's
That is such a huge part of our sentencing advocacy. And, like I said, I always just viewed it through the sort of narrow lens of if your client has special needs, but now it's every single case. Lawyers
Yeah,
need to be looking at these issues. Now, the question is, how do we get, okay, so we get you guys as experts to sort of do the declarations, you do affidavits, you'll present testimony, live testimony in court at sentencing if need be, you do all of that stuff. Is there a way to get sort of marshal extra troops of people who are in the BOP in real time who might be willing to come forward, or is that just never going to happen because nobody wants to speak out?
yeah. I mean, they wouldn't be able to. We were forbidden to do anything like that when we
Yeah.
worked for the BOP. We
You'll
just
lose your
couldn't.
job. All right. So part of what you're going to do as an expert then is not only explain the reality of prison life in real time, but you're going to help explain why a lawyer is not going to be able to get, Joe Schmo from the psych unit at this facility to come in and do an affidavit because nobody's going to speak out.
I'm going to pose a question to Maureen and Jan on this because I've covered it before, but they lived it. I mean, the BOP is notorious for retaliation among its ranks. So, there's plenty of stories. There's a lot of, retaliation stories. In fact, I want to say that there was an OIG report out there about, some of the retaliation that goes inside of the agency, but I'll let those guys talk about it.
Yeah, and it's retaliation against inmates also. So not just retaliation against staff, but when inmates speak out, there is sometimes retaliation in many different forms against inmates.
We get told like right from the beginning, we've got a public information officer. That person will do all the speaking on behalf of the Bureau of Prisons, and or if there's an attorney that's assigned there. So I remember being trained like you never talk to anybody. And I years ago worked at the Allenwood Federal Prison Camp, which, by the way, was the country club.
That's right, Watergate, right?
It was situated so close to New York that a lot of New Yorkers ended up serving time there. It didn't help matters that adjacent to the prison camp is a golf course. There's an aerial photo of it. It looked like these guys had a golf course at their disposal. They did not. However, it was back in the days when a camp was a nice place to be. But anyway, getting back to the part about speaking to the public. That's from day one. We were told, especially at Allenwood, because there was so much interest in it, we don't speak to the press. That's what a public information officer does.
Okay. I'm interested to know because we had this ray of hope in the form of Colette Peters, right? She's the BOP's, well, not so new director anymore, I guess, but she took office in August of 22. So she's been there a year. I know Rome wasn't built in a day. I know she has probably had a lot of mess to clean up, but like, how do you think this is going? And what do you think, should we still have hope that there's going to be meaningful change under this new leader?
I certainly have hope with her, and I think Jan and Walt also do. It's too early to even gauge right now because she is only in a year. I think what she brings is this whole new perspective on prisons and how inmates. It's kind of going back to where some of how we used to be under Charles Samuels as the director, and being respectful towards inmates and educating inmates so that they do become good neighbors. But I think, the big problem is you had this pushback from staff who has been, they've been under this culture of inmates have nothing coming. You know, she's coming on the heels of Director Carvajal, who came from a correctional services former captain background. So it's really difficult to change that climate that these staff have been in for so many years, where inmates have nothing coming. Programs are not a good thing. If we have a problem with inmates, we'll just lock them up in special housing unit, and they can stay there as long as we want them to stay there. So there's a lot of that. And, you know, then you have Director Peters, who wants to change this climate, and staff are saying, because we know what staff are saying, we hear from them all the time, you know, she's a hug-a-thug,
Hug a thug. I've never heard of
they-
that.
she's a hug-a-thug, she favors inmates over staff, you know, and I don't think that's true. I think what she's doing, or what she's trying to do, is really great, and that was always my philosophy. So I really get her, and I think she's really trying to do a good job. It's just very difficult when you're up against the staff mentality that's
Yeah.
currently in place.
We sort of glossed over sexual assault, and you mentioned Dublin, but I don't know that a lot of people that listen to this know how bad that was and what the story was. But it was so bad that the United States Sentencing Commission just added an extra sentencing reduction if you've been the victim of sexual assault in prison. So that tells you it's not an outlier. It was bad enough where they actually had to amend the sentencing guidelines to account for this. So tell me what was going on at Dublin, and what do you see happening? Have you heard about this stuff happening elsewhere?
I mean, I just write the articles.
Yeah.
But I know it's been a systemic problem. I mean, Maureen and I were talking about this earlier before we went on. You know, this was a problem at a Coleman women's camp, and then it was closed and became a men's camp. And then, you know, it was like, then the problem moved to Dublin. I don't think it's a new problem to the BOP, but it is, you know, it certainly hit like a low point when a warden and a chaplain at Dublin, amongst other staff, are going to prison for this, for sexual assault of women. I mean, it's almost like a movie. You just have to make it up. You just couldn't make up something so crazy.
Yeah, I mean, it's pretty unbelievable that even occurred at Dublin. But as a former warden of a female facility, back in 2009 to 2013, FCI Danbury was a female facility. So as a warden there, I would have cases, I would have inmates come to me because they were comfortable coming to me and saying, listen, you know, my friend is having sex with an officer, and that is always against the law for a staff member. There's no such thing as a consensual relationship with an inmate. And maybe sometimes the public doesn't realize that, you know, they think, well, you know, this officer fell in love with this inmate, the inmate fell in love with the officer, and so what's really wrong with it? Well, it's absolutely
the power dynamic.
law.
Yeah.
And so I would have, as soon as I would hear about something, I immediately would refer it to internal affairs. And, you know, sometimes it turned into a conviction in a sentence of imprisonment of the staff member who was having sex with an inmate. And other times there just wasn't enough evidence. But, you know, you knew in your mind that this did happen, but it just wasn't enough to rise to the level of having the person removed from their position, because you do have to have that evidence. Some inmates were smart enough to keep DNA evidence, and others were not. So it's hard when you just have somebody's word against somebody else, because a lot of times inmates feel like, well, nobody's going to believe me. But then you have this thing at Dublin where there were so many women being sexually abused by, you know, someone at the top. The warden was having sex with inmates. The warden was had photos, numerous photos of inmates that were in naked photos on his cell phone when they took and confiscated his cell phone. But
wow.
You know, and I think staff knew about what was happening, that the warden was doing this, and so all these other people thought, well, it's okay, and these other staff got involved. And And eventually, many of them were arrested. I'm sure there's many and convicted. And I'm sure there's many that just maybe weren't caught, or there wasn't enough evidence to move towards an arrest.
Hmm. How about suicide? Is that a problem?
I can just tell you from my own, I'll give you a stat. And like I said, I'm not afraid of throwing out some of the facilities that I've written about.
Yeah.
But FDC Miami has had 8 suicides in the last, I don't know, 4 years.
Wow.
Right. I mean, there are, and like, I think 5 of those have been in the last 18 months. So, there's some serious issues going on there. I mean,
Atlanta was the same way, and I think this was discussed at one of the subcommittee hearings, oversight hearings, about these suicides were occurring. The warden and executive staff were getting information about, hey, this is why this suicide occurred, so you need to put corrective action in place so it doesn't keep happening. Well, that corrective action was never put in place, and the same thing kept happening over and over, and you had multiple suicides within a short time span. And then that led to that was one of the reasons, amongst many other corruption and other problems, that they moved so many staff, almost shut down Atlanta for a period of time, moved so many inmates out of that institution, and many staff were either let go or moved to other facilities.
Maureen, our common friend Mark Allenbaugh, who provided us a great statistic not too long ago. It's not really a great, it's a meaningful statistic. There's obviously violence in prison, and there's homicides. Suicide by far is the leading cause of death in federal prison, not guys shanking one another. It's people hanging themselves or killing themselves. It's a shocking statistic for me. I look at it and go, wow.
Yeah, and the
So
BOP
preventable.
is certainly not advertising this, right? So when you have an inmate suicide, the BOP is not saying, oh, we got to notify the local news that we had an inmate suicide. No, they're trying to keep it as hush as possible. They don't want the general public knowing that they just had a suicide, let alone what Walt's talking about with multiple suicides at Miami, or multiple suicides at Atlanta. So it's until you have these oversight hearings that this information actually comes out, and people are like, oh, I didn't know about that.
Yeah. And it's especially relevant when you have a client with mental health concerns, depression, anxiety, post-traumatic stress, you name it. Judge, you need to understand that they're going into this, with these very vulnerable, and they're not going to get the help that they need. So that means they're at risk. Well, I'm going to quote from the article that you just wrote, because I think it's a good segue from what we're talking about into what we need to be talking about. So you said, we forget the responsibility that comes with taking people into custody and assuming the risks associated with their care while in custody. The incarceration of minimum security inmates reflects an unnecessary risk that prosecutors and judges push onto the Federal Bureau of Prisons. So tell me, if we're going to convince the judges to not send, I hope we could convince the judges that we could not send our clients to prison more often. Before the guidelines came out, more than half of the people got probation. Now everyone goes to prison. My goal is to see if we can stem that tide. But if we're going to do that effectively, we really need to talk about alternatives to incarceration. We need to give the judge other options than prison. And Janet, I think maybe you might be best suited to kick off that discussion, especially having done the work in the residential reentry centers and things like that. Let's just talk about what can we give to the judges as meaningful alternatives.
Well, I know you said, judges do this because they want to appear to be, I'm punishing the guy. And I wish I could speak to federal judges and tell them halfway houses are not really a cakewalk either. they're administrative in that you could have you could be celled or roomed with someone who's in a penitentiary. So I mean, there's still like dangerous situations that occur there. I don't mean to tout that, but I guess what I'm saying is, it's not like going to a halfway house is like going to the mall. I mean, it's a big deal. We pretty much know where these guys are at all time. We're using all kinds of electronic devices that are pretty high tech now. And so if they're going to be at home, they can't leave home. We can constrict them to neighborhoods, especially with sex offenders, it becomes a very useful tool. And so, but the other thing that judges have the opportunity to do is, if you want to see them spend a little bit of time in prison and, solve the conscience of the voters or the politicians or whatever, you can do that. You can give them a little bit of time in the halfway house, but then you can give them up to a year in community confinement in a residential reentry center. And we have them pretty much everywhere. I wouldn't say they're necessarily in everybody's backyard, but we've got quite a few. So typically
That would allow
them
them to like leave for work and do,
exactly.
yeah,
So
right.
their life does not have to be entirely turned upside down and on its head.
Yeah. Well, and
Um,
by the way, we're talking about predominantly white collar offenders in these camps. They've taken money, usually they have restitution, they need to pay someone back. And it always struck me as very absurd that we're going to say, we're going to put you in prison and therefore deny you any ability to make any meaningful income so that the victims can never be made whole. We talk a mean game about victims' rights and wanting to take care of the victim and everything else. And in a white collar case, when you imprison a defendant, you're basically ensuring that the victim will never be made whole. But residential reentry center, they get to go to work, they get to earn that money, and that money's going straight back to the people who were harmed by their offense in the first place. Is that right?
absolutely. I totally
Yeah.
agree.
Yeah. It's just so absurd sometimes. And Jan, you say that judges that the no cakewalk, that's punishment too. And I would love judges to just understand the whole process. From the moment the indictment comes down, is punishment. Your world is turned upside down. And the stress of the uncertainty and the financial cost of hiring lawyers and the reputational damage. And it's all punishment. It's all punishment. And judges have to get off this notion that unless we send them to prison, they're not being punished. Well, you had a pretty interesting statistic in there on home confinement, because a lot of inmates were released to home confinement, especially during COVID, to finish the rest of their sentence in a home confinement setting. Was that a successful program or an unsuccessful program?
It was, Maureen and I worked on a number of these CARES Act, who qualified and didn't qualify, counseling people on just sort of how to navigate the administrative part of that. Doug, it's so successful that it shouldn't have belonged to the BOP. You can't have something it was 99% successful, meaning that 99% of the people who were placed on home confinement finished their sentence on home confinement, as Jan was saying, on very strict conditions. And nothing is 99%. Okay, it's just not even a realistic number. And so I think it was the BOP did an excellent job of identifying those who pose the least amount of risk to the community. They placed them in that confinement, and they successfully completed their sentence. And I think that leads a lot to the First Step Act, which the First Step Act is going to start relying on home confinement. Some people are going to earn additional home confinement terms, but Jane can also speak. The BOP doesn't exactly have this massive quantity of home confinement spaces, at halfway houses to take up.
Well, let me add to that. So it used to be prior to the Trump administration, we were able to, let's say we were contracted for 30 beds at a halfway house, If we exceeded it because geographically that's just where a lot of inmates were releasing to, we just kept filling the beds. And, you know, they may have had more beds than that. Typically they do. They have more than what they contract for. And so we were allowed to kind of blank check that in the halfway house world. And then the Trump administration said, wait a minute, you know, you only have a contract for 30 beds. So you got to get rid of those 10 that you're over. And so then we had to really strictly look at this and pull back on our numbers. And that was not an easy task. So there were times that we just, you know, it's kind of like Lucille Ball on the conveyor belt of chocolate. Like there's just too many cases coming and we didn't have enough beds. But that has relaxed again, and we're able to start putting people out there. Because typically these places have more beds than they contract for because they want to have that cushion. So like I said, I've been out of it for about a year, but I think, you know, as Walt said, this is definitely a success that the Bureau of Prisons can brag about. The use of the halfway houses definitely got them through their COVID failures. Let's just say that.
Yeah.
At half the cost of
I was
being
just gonna
incarcerated.
ask. Yeah, I was
right?
just gonna ask. I have to imagine it's cheaper to do it that way.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Generally, it's cheaper.
You know, another thing I'll add to that, you know, is we need more halfway house space. The Bureau of Prisons has a terrible problem with aging facilities. I mean, they have I don't know, $3 billion of repairs to upgrade. If they were to upgrade everything, each year they throw a couple of $100 million at it. So they're just getting worse. Recently, I found out about a carbon monoxide leak at a camp at Coleman.
Yep.
It's a huge problem.
Mold problems.
Mold, Legionella, Cumberland, Maryland, Mariana camp. You know, hurricane damage to some of these facilities led to closure of the Mariana camp, and USP Atlanta, which is a holdover and had a camp. That camp closed because they had Uber drivers lined up outside to take the inmates out to go party in Atlanta or go out to eat and then come back to the camp. Crazy stuff.
Yeah, I wish judges and prosecutors would see every one of these facilities that they're sending our clients to, because that's another really important point. These are not nice places. They're not clean places. They're not just safe from a sanitary perspective or a structural perspective. Yeah, I've heard all those horror stories too. So, boy, oh boy. All right. So is there anything else we want to talk about with regard to alternatives to incarceration? We talked about halfway house. We talked about home confinement. You know, community service is always, you know, an important thing. And lawyers, you know, a little practice tip, like if you really want to convince a judge to consider alternatives to incarceration, then you have to come up with a really good plan and do some of the homework and say, you know, I've got this community service project lined up where they're going to benefit, you know, X amount of people, or, you know, whatever the case may be, you have to kind of do some of that legwork and give those alternatives. Whether the judge is going to accept them or not is anybody's guess, but if you don't give a plan, it's probably not going to go very far. But anything else on alternatives to incarceration that we didn't talk about?
You know, we have been involved, Doug, through Prisonology and specifically Jan, in writing up some declarations that then get attached to a sentencing memorandum where the attorney is trying to convince the judge to do an alternative sentence, and have been successful at that because Jan was the face of that. She was the residential reentry manager for the Chicago and that whole area. So she knows, you know, she's able to articulate in a declaration, this is how it goes in a halfway house. It's not a cakewalk. An inmate gets breathalyzed every time they come back. They're random drug tested. They can't just go out and come and go as they please. And she's able to paint a picture for the judge to say, look, this is actually a harder time than it is if this person went to a camp. You know, serving 6 months. If you're thinking about sending him to a prison camp for 6 months, send him to a halfway house, because this is what he's going to have to endure in a halfway house. And in the camp, maybe an easier ride for him, depending on the camp that he ends up going to. So she has been able to kind of convince the judges in some of these cases, and they do opt for placing the inmate in home confinement or in a halfway house.
Well, that's the takeaway. We need help to convince the judges to do the right thing in this case, and you all are that help. So hopefully people listening to this will reach out to Prisonology. It's www.prisonology.com. Walt Pablo is the man. And yeah, I mean, I use these services all the time. They're indispensable. And if we're not telling the story of prison at sentencing, we're doing a disservice to our clients in many cases. So I would encourage everybody to reach out and read Walt's stuff. And what else? Anything?
I'll give my closing comment.
Yeah, good.
When we were talking earlier about Colette Peters and what has she accomplished over the last year? I think she's accomplished a lot, but I mean, I think there's a long way to go. But I would echo the comments when she came into the job of testifying before the Senate Judiciary, and Senator Ron Johnson said, "To be honest with you, I have no idea why you want this job." So it has a lot of challenges. We went through them: staffing shortages and violence, and the facility, dealing with labor unions and a lot of different stuff. I mean, it is a tremendous amount of work that has to be done. And I think she has the support, but she's got to have people behind her too.
Well, and that's another takeaway. I think that, in the grand scheme of things, we need to affect systemic change. And that's not going to happen overnight. It's not going to happen easily. And I know Ms. Peters is working on it, but reach out to your senators, reach out to your Congress people. They are looking at these issues. They are holding hearings. Senator Joel Ossoff from Georgia, right, Maureen? Like there are people who care, and they need to hear from us and you about the truth on the ground inside those facilities. So I wanted to, well, and before we go, I am going to model my new hat. This is in it. A lot of people don't watch this on the YouTube, so they can't see the glory and the goodness that's happening right now. But I had a nice conversation with my friend Maureen Baird about a month ago, joking that some press had referred to me as a pioneer in this sentencing mitigation video work that I do. And I came to work one day, and on my doorstep was an Amazon package of this lovely, beautiful Davy Crockett faux coon. This is not a real raccoon on my head, is it? I mean, I hope not. Doesn't. I'm guessing it's a faux raccoon skin cap.
We're animal friendly here.
This is my Davy Crockett. And I love to do these things at the end of the podcast, because that's how we know if anybody's actually listening. They'll go, "Love the Davy Crockett, dude." So thank you, Maureen, for my awesome cap. I wear it with pride. And thank you, Jan, for coming on, joining the team and all you do. And thank you, Walt, for assembling this amazing team that gives this great help to our clients. So I know that we will be talking again soon, but until then, be well, everybody. Thank you.
Thanks,
Thank you.
Doug.
Take care.
That's it for today, but before we go, I just wanted to take a moment and say thank you to you, the listener, for spending time with us today getting set for sentencing. Whether you're a lawyer, someone who could use the help, or maybe you're just a true crime buff who loves the inside scoop on how this whole thing works, I am so glad you're here, and I hope you keep listening. If you're interested in knowing more about what I do, mitigation videos, case consults, live teaching, on-demand educational content, books, articles, all of it, please visit www.dougpassenlaw.com. I'm Doug Passon. Until next time, hang in there. Wait a minute, that's a stupid way to sign off on a podcast about sentencing. Hang in there. What's the matter with you, man? I guess they call that gallows humor. Sorry. All right. Well, I will see you next time on Set for Sentencing. Bye-bye.